I think that having a modern state is really critical to development. A modern state is what produces what economists call public goods. That is to say, public safety, security, infrastructure, basic public services like health and education. And I think one of the biggest failings of many poor countries is the inability of governments to do basic things like the provision of these public services. And I think you can see this in this part of Africa right now. A basic issue of security has become a big issue with the rise of terrorism spreading out of the Middle East. And if a state can't protect its own citizens, it's failing to do one of the most basic jobs that a state is there to do. It's very important to understand what state power consists of. Many governments think that power is simply coercion, meaning police and military and the ability to force people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. But in fact, the most powerful states don't use coercion, or they don't rely primarily on coercion. They rely on legitimacy. That is to say, citizens support the state and what it does and its ability to enforce laws, and they comply with the state's wishes voluntarily because they think that the state is legitimate. For the state to be legitimate, well, it helps to be democratic and to actually reflect the will of the people, but I think it also reflects the state's ability to deliver real services to citizens, things that people want, like education and economic growth and the like. And I think that in dealing with something like terrorism, it's important to understand that this is not just a matter of force and killing terrorists. It's also a matter of getting the voluntary cooperation of the people that the state is trying to protect, and that requires other things, other in a way softer forms of power than simply raw coercion. I think that one of the things that is missing in many developing countries right now is the absence of a modern bureaucracy. That is to say, the state is regarded by politicians as a feeding ground where you can get rich, you can make your family and your supporters rich by your control of the state and the state's assets. And I think a modern state is very different from that. A modern state is one in which there's a clear sense of public purpose, and you have a permanent government, a permanent bureaucracy that's chosen on the basis of merit, not on the basis of political connections, and in which the service of a public good and not just the private interests of the people in the government is the dominant value. And that means that the politicians can contest for power and they can change policies, but ultimately there's a continuity to the state through a professional civil service. And that's one thing I think is lacking in, especially in many African countries. Well, one of I think the most difficult problems in a country like Kenya is the fact that so much of the politics is ethnically based. The ethnic consciousness, I think, is actually related to the mindset that regards the state basically as a set of resources that are meant to be exploited. And so politicians get resources from the state, they distribute them to their followers, and that's why the followers support the politicians. And I think what you need is a different kind of concept of citizenship where the government is there to provide necessary public goods. It's not there to personally enrich people. And citizens need to hold their own politicians accountable for the politicians' ability to provide those basic public services, and they ought to contest for power over a clash of policies and not simply who gets to feed at any given moment at the public trough. And that's something I think basically comes through economic development, growth, If you have a middle class, if you have people with higher level of education, I think people's expectations out of government begin to change, and I think you can already see some signs of that happening in, in many parts of this region.